Panelists, I'm just going to start throwing questions out to you. So first, what should the federal government's oversight role be in terms of private schools and charters in receiving Title I funds? Judith, I'll start with you.
Well, if you receive federal dollars, you should have oversight. Simple. Too many charter schools. And I think this is the thing that gets me is the irony of like wanting accountability, but really it's really accountability for some and not for others. Accountability for some systems and not for other systems. And quite frankly, for the work that we do at Advancement Project, one of the things that we've found is that charter schools, especially on the work that we do around the school to prison pipeline, that there's like no accountability. Mayor Emanuel's school with the secret sauce, Noble Charter Network, clearly had some problems where they were charging students for demerits, and to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars off of the backs of low-income families, but there was no accountability for that. And so we can't have federal dollars going into systems where there is no one who can call them on it. I think, and I want to take that up another level in this, at the state level, the work that we're doing around school closures. Takeovers of districts like Newark, right? There is no accountability down to the ground. Parents don't have a say. And I think when we talk about what people want in the new ESEA, parents want to have a say. Communities want to have a say. They don't want some person who's been appointed the dictator of a school district to be able to run the whole system into the ground. The same system that they let failed, then they take it over. And so I think, sorry, got a little worked up around this, but as long as you're getting one penny of federal money, there should be some oversight with that.
So we completely agree. Now, again, let's just put this in perspective. States contribute 93% of funding for public schools. Federal government contributes 7%, right? Very small amount. The principle that if you spend federal dollars, there should be accountability is absolutely key. When I see a state taking over a school system and arguing that they are doing it under the auspice of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, I know that that's an exaggeration or a distortion. Newark did not submit its schools because of the ESEA. That's nonsense. The state took it over. The state had a responsibility to try to provide equal educational opportunity. And how they did, you can decide. But the question is, did they do it because of ESEA? And the answer is no. Now, we haven't talked about some of the basic things that would obviously improve schools. Look, I'm sitting here because of a teacher, right? Third grade, sixth grade, high school, teachers made a difference in my life. And the extent to which I have achieved anything in public life, I owe it to a public school teacher. We didn't talk about the fact that teachers are underpaid and undervalued. We didn't talk about the fact that teachers are often demonized in the ideological debate over the quality of public schools. When I see somebody like Bobby Jindal, governor of Louisiana, saying he's backing away from Common Core because we should have Louisiana standards, what the hell does that mean? I mean, look, I want standards that are universally recognized to lift up students because it gives them something to measure. And I'm not, that concerned about where they come from. This is not an ideological debate. This is about providing students with a core curriculum that allows them to succeed. What I find so fascinating is that there is a disconnect between the expectations that where our country will be in 25, 50 years, when the workforce is largely going to be drawn from these same kids who are being miseducated and undereducated today. Substantial percentages of our population, working population, will be drawn from these communities. And yet we're doing nothing to invest in the quality of education in a meaningful way that they receive. That's why businesses are saying, look, guys, you got to step up. We need a better quality of product. And while they may be driving states to adopt certain standards that in theory could be helpful, the fact that there is no accountability over how some of these dollars are spent, or ideological battles distort how to invest resources that get a better return, including resources and teachers, leaves us without, in my judgment, a lot of hope for how these systems operate unless we can make a showing that shows that the current system isn't working well and that we need to move toward a greater federal role. And that's where I'm headed.
I think it's been answered. You have to have accountability and transparency. And at the end of the day, I find it really interesting that a lot of the charters, and I find it very interesting that there's some people that are accountable to evidence, and there are some that are not accountable at all. So when you look at something like K-12 Inc. that uses federal dollars, and it has an abysmal record, what's happening is that people are doubling down on wanting to invest in it and have it use different, have it actually get more and more money. And so there needs to be the transparency, there needs to be the accountability, and frankly, much more important is that we need to actually have public schools be able to compete on a level playing field. And that has been, in some ways, in my judgment, the failure of state and national education policy, including Arne Duncan's policy for the last 10, 20 years.
This is a fun one. I feel like we should have a buzzer, like in Jeopardy. Republicans have a fairly unified and clearly articulated vision for how they want to redo the ESEA. There seems to be little clarity or force of message from congressional Democrats. Why is this? Are Dems missing an opportunity to tackle inequality via the ESEA? Anyone?
Judith?
No, go ahead. You can take that one.
Okay. Look, let me say, I want to draw a distinction between the House and the Senate. Okay? I want to draw a distinction. Lamar Alexander, the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which has jurisdiction over the reauthorization of ESEA, in my judgment, has taken a more balanced approach on the issue. He and Patty Murray, who is the ranking member of the committee, have forged a working alliance, a relationship that allows them to engage in a certain transparency and assessment over various provisions of the law. There will be disagreements, but I suspect that Lamar Alexander has, in my judgment, a more enlightened view. He does not come to the table with a predetermined ideological set of constraints that make it impossible to look for a fair set of outcomes. Now, it may not produce the bill we want, but having said that, I think he's taken a more enlightened view. On the other hand, the leadership in the House has taken a view that seems to be more ideologically driven. And unfortunately, the political process is not designed to deal with the nuances of public education that we've talked about here. It's not designed to deal with that, and it won't. So many of the issues that we want to have addressed in a comprehensive set of reforms are going to be outside of the No Child Left Behind reauthorization. And I do think that these party differences can materialize as we get closer to the finish line. And I think it's problematic. But I remain hopeful, guys. I remain hopeful that throughout this process of sausage making, we may see something that is a little more aligned to the totality of some of the concerns we've talked about. And one last stat here. We talked about school discipline and the impact that it has on kids' graduation and the expectations that kids will achieve. When a kid is suspended from one class, just suspended out of school one time, that reduces his chances or her chances of graduating from high school by about 40%. Just one suspension. You put two suspensions together, you're virtually guaranteed not to graduate. And there are a combination of factors that come into play. But I will say that the kinds of problems that we have heard about, where students are juggled from class to class to avoid the consequences of taking tests for which they are not going to do well, is obviously something that we're going to have to address in a meaningful way. Kids with disabilities can't be moved around as if somehow their inclusion in the totality of the student population is going to reveal a statistic that is going to be an indictment to the school. Kids with disabilities deserve fair treatment in public schools, just like every other kid. And to deny them the ability to know where they stand, in my judgment, is simply wrong. So, that distortion is likely to be reflected more in the outcome than we would hope.
And I have sort of an apolitical cousin to the last question, which is how can ESEA be better aligned with other federal laws and programs designed to fight poverty?
Well, I mean, we actually have to have some federal programs these days that are designed to fight poverty. I think, in some ways, if you look at, just look at what just happened where in immigration, where the Senate actually, I think, did try in a bipartisan way to get to a bill. House never considered it, never, refused to do any of it. The president using his authority, as every president in the past who has had to deal with immigration has done through an executive order, and literally the day or two before DACA and DAPA were to go into effect, a court in Texas utilizing or asserting states' rights on federal immigration stopped that from happening. And so I think that the issue is, yes, there should be a re-envisioning in terms of today's standards of what Johnson tried to do and Kennedy tried to do in the 60s in terms of the war on poverty. But and we've learned a lot about what we need to do, and we're seeing a bunch of municipalities like Bill de Blasio in New York City attempting to address some of these things in the absence of the federal intervention. But I think that what's happened is that because of, and I said this earlier, and I do want to actually thank the Jackie Browns and the Edie Weingartens of the world, my mom, who have kind of grown in many of us the notion that teaching and teachers do make a difference in lives. But there is not a one-to-one correlation, given everything that's going on, with the amount of effort a teacher puts in and what's going to happen in terms of opportunity of children. We need to actually have some of these other inputs, and we need to actually put a lot of this together. And so I think what's happened is that in the absence of that, a lot of people are looking at the reauthorization of ESEA in terms of let's get the balance right. Let's make sure that there's equity. Let's make sure that there is a road to equality. And let's make sure that there's an accountability systems that actually measure and reflect that and actually help kids succeed, as opposed to being kind of like a stick that simply sanctions teachers.
I'm sorry.
Last thing I'm just going to say on this is that there are a couple of other education bills that are really important. So take the Perkins Act. If the Perkins Act was actually, and Representative Klein keeps saying that he wants to pass it, the Perkins Act is a no-brainer. Reauthorizing the Perkins Act in terms of a new way of looking at CTE, Career Tech Ed, would be hugely effective and helpful for students in this country. And if you even look at the data right now, kids who are going to modern-day CTE programs are graduating from high school at a higher rate than kids in other high schools. And so why don't we, and they're also going to college. So they graduate from high school, 9 out of 10 of them graduate from high school, 7 out of 10 of them go to college. So why are we not actually looking at something like that as well? The Higher Education Act, really, really focusing on early childhood. There are things that could be done very quickly right now with bipartisan support based upon the evidence that could actually help kids.
So doesn't that tell you, though, some of the challenges, Michelle, that, I think we face? To the extent that we can't get a consensus political support for universal, high-quality pre-K, tells me that we are struggling to establish some of the most fundamental principles. That is one area that is, without dispute, one that would make a significant improvement in the quality of students and their lives, and yet we find it impossible to do that. So, guys, I'm saying, look, it would be terrific if we had an ability to connect the dots between various programs that the federal government either funded previously or is considering, and establish that connection, that connectivity. But unfortunately, we failed to do that. So, as we look at Head Start, and we talk about the success of Head Start, and yet we can't make universal pre-K a fundamental requirement, then I'm just saying, guys, we're not going to be able to achieve the kind of comprehensive solutions that we want unless we are prepared to really delve in and generate more political power than we are bringing to the table. The people, I mean, you know, commercial for voter engagement, guys. I mean, I look, you know, Judith and the Advancement Project did a lot of work in Ferguson, a lot of work. I look at Ferguson, though, and realize, my God, when you have so few of the most affected in the community voting to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, the outcome is foretold. And I think that we've got to show that there is a connection between what we are pushing, political engagement, and an assertion that we have the right to have these issues addressed in a fundamental way. And I think that teacher pay and teacher conditions are not going to be elevated as much as I wish they would by the teachers' unions. They're going to have to be lifted up by people who are outside of the unions, who recognize that teachers play an important role. We've got to be the people who articulate that principle. If you leave it to AFT or NEA, it's like they're being self-serving. And the truth is, what they are arguing for, it seems to me, is eminently reasonable by any standard. By the way, one of the groups that's a member of the Leadership Conference is Teach for America. I love Teach for America, enthusiastic about the engagement, just as AFT members are, just as NEA members are. But I think the conditions that teachers face, where they have to go into their own pockets to provide support for supplies, when arts and art education is left out of the quality of the curriculum under the guise that we simply don't have the resources to do that, are short-sighted judgments, and I think we have to counter that by challenging them politically.
Okay, so I'm log rolling now. I'm going to do an omnibus question that each of you can take whichever piece you like, and then I'm going to close with one final question. So, what?
Can we give the moderator a hand? You are very hard to moderate.
So, what policies should ESEA support to increase the capacity of principals and teachers in high-poverty schools? For example, mentoring and peer collaboration. And how do you get teachers to want to teach at lower income and urban public schools? And what solutions are there for students when their schools close? Where do they go? How do other public schools support an overflow of students? Starting with Judith.
Well, first, let's stop school closures.
Exactly.
Because I think that when we start with that as the answer, we've gone down the wrong path. Because quite frankly, I think that the idea that we have decided to close schools really is about getting rid of public schools as a social good. We've seen the dismantlement of other social goods like public housing in this country. And it is one of the last social goods that we have. And it's a social good that is, right now, we know has a majority of children who are low income. We know that many children of color are in public schools, and we don't see the public will nationally to make sure that we are shoring up public schools. And so I think that what we've seen in many places where school closures happen, what is happening is that young people get sent to some kind of welcoming school that really does not welcome them. That school doesn't have enough resources. So then we start to see a domino effect of that school then becoming the school that's on the list to be closed because they took in the kids who came from the so-called failed school. And too often we're labeling those children themselves. They know that they were labeled as failures. And so I think that we've got to back up and think about how we get the resources to those schools when there's an indication that there is something wrong, that we double down the resources on those schools, that we make sure that the teachers in those schools feel supported, that they are getting the kinds of resources they need to be in that school, that we double down on parental engagement in those schools to make sure parents are getting the kinds of support that they need to support their children. Because I think the other thing that we undervalue is the asset, the community asset of having a school in your community that may serve other functions. And so as we're also looking at this issue, instead of going to school closures, let's go to community schools, where we can find more assets and resources in the school building to support families who need that support.
You know, I really couldn't agree more with Judith's view about school closings. You know, the Leadership Conference, which primarily works in Washington as advocates on federal legislation, in order to really get a better understanding of what's happening at the state level, we have been engaged in selected communities to really see how decisions are made. So I look at Philadelphia, where we previously had a governor that was, in my view, short-sighted with respect to his investments in education. That governor was ousted by his constituents. We now have a new governor. Now, Judith and others have been involved in that community. I know Randy has been involved in that community, but I'll give you one stat. Philadelphia, as a city, had a $300 million deficit in its public education system, and yet the governor found $400 million to build 2 new prisons just outside of Philadelphia. And I refer to that as the gift to the class of 2015, because the truth is, you build those prisons, they will be filled. And they will be filled by kids who are of the age now, high school, young adult, who are going to be sucked into that criminal justice system through no fault of their own. And so, you know, there are huge problems. If you want to find out how to encourage teachers to teach in schools that are in poor communities and with less resources, you're going to have to start by paying them more, which is a reasonable requirement, offering them incentives to offer their expertise in tough schools and provide them with the measure of support that they need. Don't tell a teacher to go in, teach a class that you know is loaded with kids with a myriad of social problems, and then get surprised when the kids are not improving at the level that you would hope. You have to give them the measure of support. Let's start with offering breakfast to those who need it. Let's start with offering mentorships and other measures of support. And I like the volunteer programs that are being developed. My Brother's Keeper that the president has talked about, which obviously, by the way, should not ignore the challenges of young women and girls of color. Clearly, you've got to deal with that. And the supportive programs that develop around these kinds of initiatives, like the boys and girls mentorship programs that are in place. But don't expect these volunteer programs to do what the government, either at the state level or the federal level, should do. And that's where it does seem to me a more realistic and more transparent debate about the myriad of factors that affect the quality of education available to our students is needed.
So there's a whole lot of things to do that actually can help fix rather than close public schools. Judith mentioned one of them in terms of community schools. We've seen data from places like Cincinnati and other places that when you actually wrap services around schools, including services for families, so that schools become the center of the neighborhood again, it stabilizes neighborhoods, it stabilizes communities, and also kids do a whole lot better. And you're dealing with many of the issues that we just talked about in terms of getting adults from the community into schools to mentor, so that kids see a caring adult separate and apart from his or her parents and teachers, who then they have a connection to. When you have breakfast programs and lunch programs, when you have community college programs that actually afford adults in the community ways to have the skills for the jobs of today and tomorrow. So those things we know can work, and frankly, we know that there's an accordion about how much they cost or not. In Cincinnati, it's the cost of a Title I coordinator. Other places, it's different things. In terms of instruction, I would say that I've been through many iterations of how do you actually turn schools around. The Chancellor's District in New York City, which we did with Chancellor Crew, I would say of all the things I've ever been party to, was the most important thing I ever did as a union leader. Because what we did was exactly the kinds of things that Judith and Wade were talking about, which is you think about kids in those schools, in that school, you think about what instructional strategies will help turn things around. You think about how you build the capacity of the teaching force. You pay teachers more, and instead of having sanctions that say, if you take the risk of going to a school that's failing or that's struggling, instead of being fired, if it doesn't work, you're going to be elevated. That's the kind of thing that gives people a sense of that's the kind of thing that gives them the courage of their convictions. If you say to them, by the way, if you take this risk and it doesn't work, you're going to be fired, how many logical people would actually put themselves in that situation? And frankly, with all due respect, even Teach for America is starting to understand that as the economy is getting better, they're having fewer and fewer people who are coming into Teach for America, because you need in schooling both the exuberance of youth and the sagaciousness of the, those of us who are, have now reached a certain age. But so there's a lot of different things you can do. And frankly, ESEA, in a better funded Title II, could actually do the kinds of things like smaller class sizes, the other kinds of conditions, the kinds of incentives that CAP and we have proposed for how you build that kind of capacity, and also how you hold teachers accountable for doing the work that they have to do. Last thing I'll say. We haven't talked about evaluation or holding teachers accountable or things like that. It's not so hard. You have to ask 3 questions rather than looking at reams and reams of test data. Ask the following 3 questions. Have I gotten the tools and conditions, and I'll say it as the high school social studies teacher I once was. Have I gotten the tools and conditions I need to do my job? Number 2, have I taught the materials that I am responsible to teach? Number 3, have kids learned those materials? Those are 3 separate questions. And if the answers of no to any of those questions, then part of an evaluation is to actually find out why.
Great. Okay, so thank you, everyone in the room. You have been a very gracious audience. I apologize if I've not gotten to your questions. I'm holding the last question for myself. But I hope that you feel it's been a substantive discussion. I think that our panelists all had a cogent and compelling argument for the role of the federal government on ESEA at 50 and what it should be engaging in and how it keeps equity at the center. I am a mother and an activist, and I am also the granddaughter of a trade unionist. And I learned at her knee that you never get a group of people in a room without asking them to do something. So I am turning it over to the panelists with the last question, which is, what is the role of the activists and those of you assembled in the room around ESEA? What would each of you ask those here now to do? What is the role of the community? What should people be doing to make sure that equity remains at the center and at the forefront as we move forward?
Wow. I could write a treatise on that. No. So first, just a few things. One of which is just a, administrative thing, but also in the packet. We have a letter that was written on behalf of several civil rights organizations and grassroots groups that deals with the accountability and testing piece, and we are looking for more sign-ons to that letter. And you can also sign on to that letter by emailing Dewana Nicole, dnicole@advancementproject.org. And the reason that I'm putting that out there is because there is a movement of parents and young people who are fighting for public education, and that they get what the so-called unintended consequences of NCLB have been. They get it every day. They face it every day. They have to deal with it every day. And so as they fight for equity, as they fight for more resources, as they fight to keep their schools, the thing that we have to continue to do is to build public will for public schools. We have to make sure that parents and young people's voices are being heard in this discussion, because they're the ones who get it.
Okay, and Randy actually has to go right now so that she can catch her.
Absolutely.
I just would say, if you believe that that kids should get a chance, talk to your congresspeople about what is needed in schools right now. They may say, that's not my job, but talk to them. Talk about what kids need. Talk about how we need to actually have resources to lower class sizes, to have paraprofessionals, to have community schools. I think the equity issues become more paramount right now in terms of how this is wending its way. And frankly, some people will want to make it about accountability. If we don't make it about equity, then shame on us. That's what we need to do. And that's what I would ask you, urge you to do, whether it's through the investment project, whether it's through the Leadership Council, whether it's through us, whether it's through other groups. Just talk about what kids need. Thank you.
Yep, here. Let me say, guys, I completely support both sets of comments, and I would just close with this one point, picking up on Judith's observation. Look, building public will in support of public schools is what we need to do. But there is a direct correlation between political participation and your ability to build public will. Communities that are most adversely affected by the decisions that we're talking about today find themselves to be the communities with the lowest level of political participation by the affected individuals in those communities. So we're going to have to organize, guys. We're going to have to organize poor people. We're going to have to organize middle-class families. We're going to have to organize people who support and understand the value of public education. And we're going to have to organize to avoid the kind of fragmentation that you see in many communities, in which the interests of some are pitted against the interests of others, and the argument is that we have a zero-sum game with a limited pot of money that we can draw on. I'm not saying money is unlimited, by no means, nor am I suggesting that money is the answer to every problem we've identified. But unless there is a willingness to know that equity requires investment, and investment requires political will, and political will requires voter participation and engagement, we won't accomplish what we've talked about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you to our moderator.
Thank you.